Welcome to Coach Talk with Shawn and Alex, a new feature here at Trail Tales ARP, a running podcast. Alex, thanks for joining me today.
My pleasure, Shawn. Good to be chatting with you.
Yeah, man, for sure. So, for those of you who don't know, Alex was a previous guest on the show, and he's an elite level cross country skier as well as a very talented runner as well. And we had such a great conversation on the show, and we've gone out for a run together, and we both share this passion for like human physiology and how it pertains to sport and how we can kind of tap into that knowledge and put it into practice with our training and with our running to help improve our performance. So we decided to do research and write up scientifically based articles to share with you with little things and tips and tricks that you can employ into your own training to help you kind of improve and get better results. So Alex was gracious enough to do the very first article on this feature. And Alex, this one's all about beetroot juice supplementation, how it's going to make you run faster.
Exactly. There's been a lot of literature in the past decade or so looking at both the endurance aspects of the beetroot or nitrate supplementation. So looking at marathon runners, 5K, 10K runners. And there's also been some emerging research in the last few years looking at sprint research and more explosive activities to see if there's differences that the nitrates or beetroot can have.
Okay, so there's a potential here for this strategy, if you will, to kind of help with endurance sports as well as kind of more explosive stuff like sprinting or like even with your cross country skiing and stuff like that.
Absolutely, especially with the endurance sports. The research seems to show that the less trained the individuals are, the more optimal that the beetroot may have an effect. So the more highly trained the athlete becomes, we see they have excellent capillarization in all their skeletal muscles and they have good muscle contractility. Whereas for less trained individuals, these pathways may not be quite as refined. So that's why we think that the nitrate may be more effective.
Okay, and you know that makes a lot of sense too. If you think about like weight training, for example, you know, somebody who hasn't really weight trained, they hit the gym and in a few months they're noticing these big changes in their strength and their body composition, and all of a sudden think, wow, in a few more months I'm going to be Mr. Olympia. But then you plateau, right? Because your body adapts, and then the gains are a little bit more difficult to achieve. So it makes sense as to why a highly trained elite athlete would maybe improve a little bit less on a scale of things, like comparing relative gains to somebody who's not trained. Right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Because the beetroot we know has the effect on skeletal muscle contraction, vasodilation, and cellular respiration. So when these are already optimized in more elite individuals, they're going to see less of an effect. But for perhaps the less trained individuals, just kind of train maybe a few times a week or getting into the sports and before races or intervals, it might be worth experimenting if this has a positive effect for them.
Yeah. So let's get into this super root, if you will, and
Yeah.
talk about it. So you know, you're talking about dietary supplementation here, right? And one of the things that you had stated, I'm just going to go to my notes here, was that beetroot juice can optimize skeletal muscle efficiency by reducing the O2 cost of submaximal exercise, which will improve your muscular performance. So let's talk about that. Why is that important? Why is reducing the O2 cost of submaximal exercise important?
Right. So the more efficiently you're able to train or race at, the easier it's going to be on your body. So if you can make the economy of movement that much easier for the same heart rate, you're going to be able to travel that much faster. So let's say you're racing at 5-minute kilometers. If you can do that more efficiently, that's going to create faster, easier running performance, as opposed to just struggling not using the supplement. You may not be able to maintain the same pace.
Right. So it's almost like, you know, if you want to compare it to like fuel mileage in a car, you're getting a lot better fuel mileage.
Exactly.
out of it, right? So
Right.
yeah, that's pretty cool. So that's why it's important, right? And you
Mhm.
have studies and research here that backs up that statement. So let's get into that. For those of you who have never been to our website, trailtalesarp.com, or have listened to the podcast before, um, these articles that we're talking about are up on the website, and it's under Coach Talk with Shawn and Alex. So you can find these articles there, actually the ones we're talking about. So Alex, let's go through, if you will, if you can take us through the diagrams you have that are depicting the intrinsic nitric oxide production pathway, as well as the extrinsic dietary pathway. Can you kind of explain that to us? Because there's a diagram there, but it can be a little bit confusing if you're not sure what you're looking at. So
Right. So on the left of the diagram is the NOS-dependent pathway. So it's the NOS enzymes breaking down L-arginine, an amino acid in the body that can be both consumed through diet and fish and poultry, but it's also naturally produced as well. So this L-arginine gets broken into nitric oxide, and the nitric oxide is the gaseous molecule that's extremely important for cellular respiration and muscle contraction, whereas the dietary pathway is breaking down the nitrates eaten. So this can be through spinach or beetroot, any leafy greens in general that are high in nitrate. That gets reduced by oral bacteria in the mouth into nitrite. So that NO3 into NO2 nitrite, and that NO2 is further reduced to nitric oxide. So this nitric oxide is extremely important, as we discussed, but more so in environments of altitude or low oxygen availability. So this could be if you're running a marathon, let's say out in Canmore, where the altitude is about 1,500 meters, or Salt Lake City, where the altitude is about 2,000 meters. It might have a greater effect at altitude venues, or also in type 2 fibers, which are more glycolytic, so more anaerobic type fibers, whereas in aerobic or type 1 fibers, like marathon runners typically have, it's also perhaps not as effective as with the type 2.
okay. And have you come across any literature that kind of describes how this molecule is actually helping us run better or be more efficient? Like, is there vasodilation going on? Is it allowing the cells to consume oxygen more efficiently? How does it all kind of work?
Exactly. The vasodilation aspect of the nitrate consumption has been looked at in quite a few different populations, even in clinical populations where some individuals may struggle with diabetes or other respiratory issues. And I think the dietary nitrate is going to allow more vasodilation for better blood circulation in certain populations. And when we're racing, we also know that you want vasodilation to the demanding muscles,
Mm-hmm.
and vasoconstriction more towards the digestive tract, things that aren't going to be active. So if we can have optimal vasodilation to the recruited fibers, that's going to be very beneficial. And if
Absolutely.
the nitrate's going to help with skeletal muscle contractility, then that's going to create more forceful racing, more
Absolutely.
better muscle output.
Okay. And you did mention, respiratory issues as well. So will this act on the smooth muscle in our respiratory area as well?
I believe so. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, it makes sense, right?
Right.
Okay. So further on in your article, you went through some meta-analysis of different studies
Mhm.
that looked at, I guess it was all beetroot
Right.
supplementation, right?
That were some studies also could use in a pill format too, whether just a pill loaded with a placebo nitrate or actual nitrate,
Okay.
or a beetroot juice with full of nitrate, or a beetroot juice with the nitrate extracted. So
Okay.
both would be like in a shot format from maybe a 250 milliliter concentrated juice, whereas just like a natural squeezed beetroot or juiced beetroot might be a little you may need a bit more of that than the concentrated, super
Mhm.
concentrated.
Yeah, and obviously being able to consume the same amount of nitrate in a smaller volume of liquid is going to be better for you, right? Especially if you're taking acutely before a
Right,
competition. You don't want all that fluid sloshing around in your belly.
right. The other option too is to take it a little more chronically. So in the 3 to 5 days leading up, the athletes could consume beets with all of their meals. So maybe
Right.
have a cup of beets each night with your meal, or just be cautious on race morning if you haven't been taking it regularly. So
That's a good point because you don't want to introduce something new, especially with your GI system and everything right before competition. Maybe something to play with during training when there's not so much on the line. Because
right,
nothing would be worse than training for a period of months to get to your goal race, and then all of a sudden you add this into that, thinking, all right, I'm going to run faster and be more efficient. And also, I'm like, oh no, I'm not feeling
right,
so great.
right.
So get that found out during your training. Yeah. So I'm gonna try to do a screen share here with you, see if this pops up, and see if we can get that graph from your article. Um, let's see if this works here. Can you see your article there?
Yep,
Okay.
perfect.
Okay. So
Left.
yeah, so it's just on the left there. I don't know if I can make it bigger for you.
Perfect. Yeah,
There we go. Okay. So let's have a look at that. Why don't you break this down for us?
for sure. So the first thing that's important to notice is the acute dietary supplement dose, which is in the red bars, versus, or sorry, the chronic is in the red bars and the
Okay.
acute is in the blue bars.
Okay.
So with the chronic supplementation, this means the athlete or participant of each of the studies was taking the supplement in the days preceding. So perhaps 3 to 5 days consistently they would have their dose, whereas the acute dose would be 2 to 3 hours before, the blue bars, that is, 2 to 3 hours before the participant would come and take the supplement.
Okay.
The difference is with the chronic, there might be more of a prolonged effect, whereas acute, it just can be more immediate. Now you can see the top 7 studies, they're recreational or moderately trained individuals. And interestingly, most of those studies have a positive effect. 5 out of the 7 are statistically significant. All the statistically significant ones have a star beside them.
Okay.
So all of the chronic dosing there was positive. And this is both in cycling and running time trials. You
Awesome.
can see what type of studies each of them are. They're mainly running and cycling studies. But what's interesting now, in the bottom 17 studies, I believe it is, there were
Okay.
a few kayaking studies. The bottom and third from bottom were looking at kayakers. And interestingly enough, there was a positive effect there. And a couple of the middle studies looking at 2-kilometer rowing also had a positive effect. So perhaps the musculature in these highly trained athletes, more upper body type 2 fibers, a lot of the emerging discussion with some of the scientists looking at nitrate are now realizing that, okay, maybe type 2 fibers, whether in the upper body or trained lower body, like in sprinters, maybe the nitrate's more effective in these populations.
Okay. That's very interesting actually, and it's always great to see new ways of looking at studies that have been done, and you want to see how it's going to affect a different group of individuals, right? That's how we learn and grow. One thing I find interesting here is it doesn't appear that any of the studies that showed negative effects on the time trial performance are actually statistically significant. Um, compared to the ones that do show improvements, quite a few of them are statistically significant, right? So the
Right.
evidence is definitely supporting the statement earlier that this will make your running or your training better, right? Your performance better. So I do want to ask you though, what do you think may have attributed to the ones that experienced mainly negative outcomes, like a
Yeah.
decrease in performance?
So we see one in the recreational athletes who was negative, and
And it's
about
only one, yeah.
yeah, and maybe only 30 or 40% of the elite athletes. But I think this could be because perhaps those elite athletes in particular have their pre-race routine all set. And when, the researchers are maybe trying to add something like the nitrate, that could have effect on their GI system.
Okay.
Maybe there's some sloshing around in the stomach they're not comfortable with. Whereas I think with the recreational or moderately trained individuals, perhaps they have a bit less experience and the substance is more effective for them because they don't know the difference, or their body responds more effectively as a result of their body handling it better.
Right. And again, that makes a lot of sense. And it's interesting to see that most of the negative effects here were in the highly trained and elite athletes, right? So they're the ones that are going to be least likely to have better improvements, but they still do show a lot of improvements there, but it's quite split down the middle if you really look at it. But pretty interesting stuff there, Alex, and I appreciate how you broke that all down in that chart there. It's really good. Really good. And it's important to note too, like the negative impacts there, you're looking at, around 0.5%, between 0.5 and 1.5% in the total performance. Whereas you compare that to the improvements, especially in the recreational and moderately trained individuals, they're looking at greater than, 2.5% improvements, which is, when you're racing, like the smallest advantage can mean the difference between first place and like fourth place. It's so close.
Absolutely, it's huge. And they're finding that if you look at those recreational studies, that was in both 3-kilometer running untrained and 4-kilometer cycling, as well as some longer events like 16-kilometer cycling and 10-kilometer cycling. So it seems like across a wider distance range for the recreational especially seems to be positive.
That's actually a good point you make there as well.
Yeah.
All right, so we'll get rid of that chart now. That was really good. So let's move on here. Talked about the meta-analysis, and then you went into in the article talking a little bit about dosages, right? So let's talk a little bit about dosages. So from what I see here, obviously everything that we do is going to be dose dependent, right? A lot of times medications, the difference between poisoning yourself or having a therapeutic effect is all based on the dose, right? So the same would definitely be said for supplements and stuff like that when you're looking at performance, right? You want to have that sweet spot in your dosing where you're going to see improvements, right? And subsequently, if you're taking too much of something, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to enhance your improvements, right? It could be negligible or it could actually cause a negative impact, right? So we talked here. So the dose amount also plays a role with, you're talking about less than 8.5 millimoles, which is a measurement of the substance within the blood, right? Which is equivalent to 527 milligrams around there, being the most effective dose from the studies. And you went on to say it's not a huge amount, but it can, in fact, it can be achieved through normal diet. And you wrote
a cup of beets or a cup of spinach.
Absolutely. So that's not that much. And to be able to, is that something you'd want to be having on a daily basis, I guess? Because you talk about, chronic supplementation versus the acute dosage. I would imagine, I don't know if I'm right here, but is the acute dosage going to be significantly higher than what you would be taking on a chronic timescale?
Typically, yeah, that would make more sense. As long as you have the nitrate levels elevated over time, I think that could be just as effective as opposed to taking one huge dose of it the morning of.
Right.
So I think it's important in the days preceding. I don't think you need to consume beetroot on a daily basis. Perhaps just in the 3 to 5 days leading up to a race in particular, or just as part of a healthy diet, maybe twice every week, and then in your race week then go to maybe the 3 days preceding.
Gotcha.
I don't think it needs to be on a everyday basis.
Right. Almost kind of like an in-season type of thing as you're
Right.
approaching the race, right?
Then again, I imagine many athletes on a daily basis are consuming kale, spinach, beets, these nitrate-rich vegetables anyways. So
Yeah.
I'm sure that could be a contributing factor to why the elites respond optimally anyways.
That's a good point. That's a good point.
Mhm.
And then you said some studies, they looked at a maximal dose at 19.5 millimoles. So I did a little bit of quick math. So that's going to be equivalent to just over 1,200 milligrams. So,
Right,
or like that's like 6 cups of beetroot. So that's a lot of beetroot. But you had mentioned earlier that you can get it in concentrated forms, so you don't
right,
have to have all that volume.
right. There's Beat. The BEETIT is a company, I believe they make shots of it actually.
Okay.
So there are brands out there that are making supplements that you can take shoot race morning, for
Nice.
example.
We'll have to talk to them about getting some sponsorships for us.
Yeah.
It's funny. I think it's important to note here too. While we're talking about beets, is they have a very distinct color, and they go in red, but they also come out red. So you might think you're like bleeding out, but you're not. So
Right.
it can be a surprise sometimes for some people.
Yeah.
Um, all right, so that's pretty good. Talk about the dosages and stuff like that. So we also talked about, or you talked about in the article,
Hmm.
highly trained athletes, right? You had mentioned this before. They'll have greater skeletal muscle capillarization and lower type 2 fibers, right? Um, and you had already mentioned that some of these athletes are going to be very diet conscious, so they might be getting this in their normal diet anyways. Um, so what I kind of wanted to ask was, we're talking about type 2 muscle fibers, right? And there's been some research that may suggest that this is going to help with those types of athletes as well, right?
Mhm.
So can we briefly go through the types of muscle fibers and how they work? You okay with
Right.
doing that?
So the type 1 fibers are considered oxidative fibers. They're also sometimes known as um, the red fibers, where they're kind of like quite full of blood and high hemoglobin concentrations.
Yeah, and that's what gives it that red color, the myoglobin inside the cells, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Compared to the type 2 fibers, they're sometimes attributed to the white fibers and rely more on the glycolytic pathways. So in glycolysis, the ATP production doesn't allow for the rest of the cellular respiration, like electron transport chain, to occur. And instead, they're just greater lactic acid production. So within the type 2 fibers, they have less of the oxidative capacity.
Okay. And so the thinking here is that supplementing with the beetroot juice is going to help their limited capacity work better.
Right,
Pretty much.
exactly.
Okay. And those are the fibers that you're going to be using with more explosive movements, right? Like if for running like 100, 200 meters, right?
Right,
Like you're going to have phosphate, but you're also going to have the type 2 fibers. And that's why if you look at sprinters versus endurance runners, for example, sprinters, I think of like, well, Usain Bolt. I couldn't think of his name for a second right now, right? Or even, Donovan Bailey, big, strong guys, right? A lot of musculature on them. They're lean, but they got big muscles, right? So they got a lot of type 2 fibers there because they're explosive right off the bat. And they're
yeah,
going at maximal effort for that 100 meters, 200 meters, 400 meters relay, whatever it is, right?
exactly.
As compared to endurance athletes, you look at somebody like Mo Farah, for example, right? Skinny as
Very
a twig,
lean.
not, yeah, very lean, skinny, but their body's adapted to what they've been putting it through, right?
Right,
So it's and they've got more type 1 fibers, right? Because they're more attuned to being endurance, right?
for
So
sure.
they're going to be using energy a lot from like oxidative processes, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. So it's pretty interesting. It's almost, whatever you put your body through, it will adapt and form to that, right? If you think about swimmers, they all have very similar body style. And they're not in the gym trying to work out to look that way or to develop that way. It's primarily from the swimming that they're doing, right? Big,
Right.
strong upper bodies and things like that. You look at cyclists, huge quads, cross country skiers like yourself, right? Just
Yeah,
like massive quads because that's what you're primarily using, right? And then you have
exactly.
all the other stuff too. So, if your quads are well developed with your skiing, for example, right? You know that a lot of it is upper body as well. So trying to get the advantage there as well, right?
Right.
Yeah, because if you have guys you're competing against that aren't really focusing on the upper body as much, and you are, you're
Yeah.
gonna you're gonna have that advantage. And even if it's a small advantage, again, could mean the difference between first place and not finishing on the podium at all, right?
Exactly. Especially at the elite level, every second, every percent is so important.
Yeah, absolutely. Like you had mentioned on the interview we did on the podcast that you kind of really like the shorter events because you like kind of just giving her and seeing what you're made of, right?
Yeah.
And going fast. And I noticed in your video on your YouTube channel, um, in your race from the FISA games, is that you took off like you were ahead of everybody right at the beginning, like it wasn't even close. So you have that explosive power for sure.
Yeah. And the other thing with ski racing too, even for our distance events where we race 5 kilometers to 30 kilometers, the terrain is still varying, right? So we have some climbs. So when you're climbing, you're able to work hard with the type 2 glycolytic fibers, but then you get to rest and recover. So even in our distance racing, because it's so interval based, I'd argue there's still some type 2 fiber involvement. And similar to hockey, right? You work hard on your shift for 30 seconds or a minute,
Yeah.
then you get your rest. I'd say hockey players also very type 2 based. Runners, especially because you don't get a glide phase, you don't get to recover like we do on the downhills and skiing.
True.
So the fiber type, especially for runners, I think is more type 1 dependent, very repetitive. Your body has to withstand all the pounding
Yeah.
and yeah.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's with running with your training too, it still is important to add that speed work and work on those type 2 fibers because there are, if you're trying to overtake somebody or you're trying to kick at the end or you're running a shorter distance, you're going to want to have those type 2 fibers available to work at a better pace, right?
Often with the runner development that from a young age, they start with, 1500 meter, then progress to the 3K, 5K. And the top marathon runners have a huge track background before the age of 25, 30, 35, before then they're going to marathon.
Yeah.
But once they have that speed background first, then they can start putting in the bigger miles.
Yeah, for sure. It's pretty interesting stuff. So Alex, what are your takeaways from all the research that you did in your article?
The biggest takeaways I would say is that athletes should consider taking nitrate supplementation through a beetroot shot the morning of, but probably the most optimal and easiest way to do so is through beetroot consumption in the 3 to 5 days preceding your race. So that can be done at dinner. Just consume a cup worth of beets. That could be shredded, boiled, whatever you like.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that will have a positive effect, especially in recreational athletes in many different sports like running, cycling. Whereas for elite athletes to see an effect, the research is now indicating perhaps more type 2 explosive fibers.
Awesome. So, where can people find you, Alex? Because you have your own YouTube channel. So, Alex, again, like I said, he's an elite level cross country skier, and your 10K time is like 34 minutes or something, and like you have a crazy 5K time as well, right? Like stuff I'll never get to myself. So, on your YouTube channel, you kind of share your training strategies and things like that. So, where can people find that?
So my YouTube channel is under Alex Maycock on YouTube right now, and I have some vlog series outlining what my weekly training looks like. And then I'm working on some technical videos specific to cross country skiing, looking to get into some more coaching in the next few years.
Wonderful. That'll be good. I think you'll make a great coach because you've got this great knowledge background based in science and stuff, but you've also got the experience because of the level that you're competing at right now, you know. So it's pretty good combination for sure. And what about other social media? Do you have an Instagram account?
Yeah, Instagram for Alex Maycock, and Twitter, Facebook as well.
Awesome. So if you want to get more from Alex, from his side of things, please go check out those things. I'll put them in the notes under the video. For myself, if you want to check out the podcast, it's available on Apple, Spotify, Amazon, if you're in the US, UK, Japan, and Germany, I think. Pretty much anywhere that podcasts are shared, you can find us. It's Trail Tales ARP for a running podcast. And also you can get this article that we talked about today at trailtalesarp.com under Coach Talk with Shawn and Alex. And please leave some comments on the bottom of this video. It is our first video, so, you know, the quality might be crappy for now, but we're going to work on it and develop this as we kind of go along. But we just want to get this information out there and share it with you all. And stay tuned for our next article and subsequent video. Any closing thoughts, Alex?
Run happy, run wild.
Run wild, buddy. There we go. That's right. All right. We'll talk to you later, buddy.
Cool.
Take it easy.